And welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight on National Crime Victims' Rights Week. The annual event celebrates the progress achieved, raises awareness of victims' rights and services, and shows solidarity with survivors whose lives have been forever changed by violent crime. So joining us live in studio are Brandon Merrill, Executive Director of Utah Homicide Survivors, and Deborah Dilley, a survivor herself. Thank you both for being here tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Let's start with you, Deborah. Okay, so we already mentioned you're a survivor and now a service provider. Could you share a little bit about your story and then how it led to where you are today?
I think the most interesting thing about my story is that I never identified as a survivor or a victim until I actually started working in this field. I'm a domestic violence survivor, but there's a lot of elements to domestic violence that you don't really get to see or know about. And when I first came into this work, I thought I knew what a victim looked like. And because my ex-husband had never punched me, I never thought of myself as a victim. And I had just started working at the time. I was working at the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault, completely new in the field, hardly knew anything. And I was at a training event. We were tabling up at the Capitol. And in between sessions, it gets really boring and you start talking to your coworkers.
Right.
And we were getting to know each other. And I started to tell them the story about the saga around the ex-husband. And my coping mechanism is humor. So I was making jokes and talking about how what happened wasn't a Lifetime channel movie, but a full mini-series. And I was minimizing what happened. And I was taking the blame for everything that happened because I thought that that I couldn't call him abusive because he never physically hit me. But he did a whole lot of other things that were pretty awful. And as I'm telling this story to my coworker, she stopped me. And we had flyers on the table, and she hands me something called a power and control wheel. And researchers 30 plus years ago had done interviews with a bunch of survivors from domestic violence, and they'd found 8 different categories of what made up the elements of abuse. And she had me circle every little thing on there that he did.
Oh, wow.
And I started to circle and kept circling and kept circling and kept circling. And everything on that list was circled with the exception of him laying hands on me. And it was a really powerful moment. It was an epiphany moment because all of a sudden I had a name for what happened to me. Somebody had finally told me that I wasn't crazy, I wasn't making it up, I wasn't a bad wife. And there were so many things that opened up, I was able to give myself grace for what had happened. But if I hadn't had that conversation with my coworker who was an advocate, I would still have been blaming myself. If I hadn't come into this work, I still would have been blaming myself. And there's so much power when somebody says, I believe you,
yes,
and you're not making this up.
Most definitely, most definitely. And power as soon as you can acknowledge it. And like you said, you were given the words to describe what it was that you were living with. Wow, thank you for sharing that. And Brandon, how did you two become connected or acquainted with one another, I should say?
Well, we got connected through a mutual nonprofit, the Utah Crime Victims Legal Clinic. Deb is a bookkeeper for a lot of small nonprofits around here. And we really needed somebody to help us with our granting and bookkeeping, and we got connected that way, and then we became really close friends after interviewing her on our podcast together. And it just really, it amazes me every day, the stuff that Debbie is able to do.
Right, most definitely. I'm amazed already. I've just heard a snippet of her story. Tell us about the organization, Brandon, Utah Homicide Survivors. What kind of services or resources does it offer to the community?
So Utah Homicide Survivors is focused on providing legal services for families of murder victims throughout the state of Utah, and also social services. We offer therapy programs as well for English and Spanish speakers. So we really focus on providing all of this for free to people who have had probably the worst thing ever happen to them, where they have lost a loved one due to the actions of another person. And we really just try to focus on helping them heal through the court system and through our therapy programs.
Such an important organization. Deborah, in your personal and professional experience, what are some of the challenges or barriers or difficulties even that victims of violence crimes often face?
I think There is, when you are in that role, when you are being harmed, because you've lost so much control, you end up blaming yourself for a lot of things in an effort to regain control in a way. And I think one of the largest barriers that victims have is that they don't have the words to describe what happened. They don't know where to go for help. A lot of people don't understand the nuances of domestic violence and of sexual violence and how that can look and how that can play out and how that can feel. And so they just don't have, or they don't know that there are resources out there to help them through. A lot of these crimes, they're hidden, and victims are silenced a lot, and just knowing where to be able to speak and to have someone believe you when you talk about your story.
Yeah, and like you've said, if you don't have the words to share it and you feel at blame for it all, I could see why people don't even talk about it. What is this year's theme, Brandon, for National Crime Victims' Rights Week? And what does that theme mean to you?
So this year's theme is support victims, build trust, and engage communities. And what that means, at least to me, is that we, no matter what somebody is saying, we start by believing what they have said, believing that they have been victimized, because we are there to support them through this traumatic event. The other thing that we might need to do is just literally sit there and be with them. And finally, I think it's about connecting them with proper resources that can help. For instance, if someone is a victim of crime, the Utah Crime Victims Legal Clinic is amazing, and they provide crime victims representation throughout the criminal process, so that way the victim has a voice in the criminal process against their perpetrator. And organizations like this are all over the state where they are trying to help victims in any way that they can. And the biggest way we can do that as a member of our state to help support them is by connecting them with these resources.
There is so much more we want to talk about. Brandon and Deborah, we're going to have you hold the thought where we're at. We're going to take a quick commercial break. You want to stick with us as we resume our In Focus discussion on National Crime Victims' Rights Week. We'll be right back. All right, and thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on National Crime Victims' Rights Week. Before we went to break, we were joined by Brandon Merrill, Executive Director of Utah Homicide Survivors, and Deborah Dilley, a survivor herself. We're going to pick up right where we left off. Thank you both again for being here, by the way. Brandon, you co-host a podcast called Utah Survivors. Tell us why this podcast was started and what you hope to achieve from it.
You know, as a newer organization, new nonprofit organization that serves victims in Utah myself, I have been fascinated by all the different victim service providers in the state. And so really what I wanted to do was start a podcast that highlights these organizations, but also we pair it and we try to be, we call ourselves a new kind of true crime podcast where we get the stories straight from the survivors, and we let them tell their version of it rather than dictating to others what their story is. And this really gives their voice back to them, and then we follow it up the next week with that nonprofit that helps victims in similar circumstances. So that way we have a pairing of a victim story and a resource that helps people that might identify with the story that we told the week before.
Wow, a powerful duo there. So Deborah, you did participate as a guest on this podcast. What was your experience like, and how did it help you in your healing process?
It was very interesting because, working in this field, I don't talk about my story that often. And I know that, I've been working with Alex for years, and I just started working with Brandon, and to have them see this particular side of me, I felt so vulnerable, but they were so caring through it. And the process of being able to tell my story and also listen to it has been very, life-changing in a way, because you always sound a little bit different than how you sound in your own head when you're speaking. And so I've listened to my podcast multiple times, and it's so weird to hear what sounds like somebody else telling my story. And it just reminds me that I'm not alone in many ways. But it was so empowering to be able to have that moment of telling the story and really kind of hoping that it helps others.
And as you said, brought a little bit of healing. And that's a very interesting concept. Like you said, you have these crime podcasts where people are dictating or writing others' stories, but this is them sharing in their words. Wow. Deborah, every survivor story, complex and different, of course. How does the podcast help dispel myths and educate the public on the matter?
Similar to, having that moment of the power and control wheel handed to me that I talked about earlier, the podcast really does show the different nuances of the types of violence that are out there and then how people have overcome that. And I think that is a really important aspect of the podcast. It's not just, entertainment. It is really teaching in a way that is not exploitative.
That's huge. And Brandon, this is your podcast. It has more than 40 episodes already. What have you learned from hosting it?
I think the biggest thing that I've learned is that while a lot of survivors have similar things that have happened to them, the way that they are victimized is so different, and the way it has affected them is so different. I've learned so much just from listening to other nonprofits or other victim service providers within the state talk about how trauma affects the brain, how people react differently to these type of events, and it was something that I had no idea about before.
And are you looking for more guests to feature on the podcast? If so, tell people how they can find your podcast if they want to listen in.
Yeah, we're always looking for survivors and nonprofits that want to tell their story or tell about their organization, because this really is a way for us to build our community together, just like in this year's theme. It's been going on for more than a year now with the podcast, but we are always looking for more people willing to share their story. If you want to find our podcast specifically, you can go to utahsurvivors.org, or you can find the podcast on Spotify, Apple, anywhere where you would normally listen to podcasts.
All right, say the podcast name again, right?
Utah Survivors Podcast.
Utah Survivors Podcast. Okay, and before we go, both of you, if you can take a second to just brainstorm your final words, what's your message to other survivors or our viewers who are watching tonight? We'll start with you, Deborah.
You are not alone, and you have value. Your story has value, and there are people out there who will believe you, and people out there who are more than willing to help you heal.
Powerfully said, thank you. And Brandon, do you have any words you'd like to share as well?
I believe you, and I'll listen.
Simple, sweet and
Very simple,
and that's
yep.
all we need to hear. Powerful words. We really appreciate both of you coming and joining us here tonight. Again, you've been hearing from Brandon Merrill, Executive Director of Utah Homicide Survivors, and Deborah Dilley, a survivor herself. Thank you both for being here tonight. We appreciate you taking part in this important conversation. We'll be right back. And welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on National Crime Victim Rights Week. In our last segment, we were joined by a survivor and victim advocate. Now we're going to turn to Gary Scheller, the director for the Utah Office for Victims of Crime. Gary, thank you for joining us tonight, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
I'm going to just put this out there. I hope you don't mind. Gary just got married this week and is making time for us on this show. So again, thank you to you. Tell us, Gary, about your agency, the Utah Office for Victims of Crime.
Yeah,
what services and resources you provide to survivors.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And tough act to follow, Deborah and Brandon both. They're two real heroes in the state. So the Office for Victims of Crime is part of the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, part of the Governor's Office. And we have several different functions that we provide for the state. One is the reparations program for the state. We manage the Crime Victim Reparation Trust Fund. That's a program that allows individual victims of violent crime to apply for benefits to help them with their out-of-pocket costs, such as funeral and burial, mental health, medical, those expenses that a person will have as a result of being a victim of a crime. Last year, we spent about $5.5 million on about 7,000 applications that were sent into the program, helping folks with those benefits. The other aspect of the office is that we manage federal grants, tens of millions of dollars that come into the state every year that fund the excellent programs like Brandon's and Deborah's. So we spent about, last year, we spent about $22 million, awarded $22 million across the state to a little over 150 different programs, most of them nonprofits, either public or private nonprofit entities. About $12.5 million went to those nonprofits, and about $6 million to rape crisis type programs, another $6 million or so through children's justice centers And these are programs that provide hands-on services to victims of crime. And then we also provide staffing and support to the Utah Crime Victims Council. And the Utah Crime Victims Council is a statutory body within the governor's office that pursues policy that is sensitive or favorable to victims within the criminal justice system. And it's the Utah Council on Victims who we can thank primarily for the state of Utah actually having a crime victims' rights amendment in our state constitution. They were very vigorous in their pursuit of that back in 1994 and were able to get it passed. So,
wow. I just have to say thank you to you. I think as you have these survivors who don't know exactly where to turn or how to get the resources to, you know, go about the process they need to go through as they're healing, and to know that they can turn to an organization like this that can help them navigate that. Just a huge, huge help. Brandon and Deborah touched a little bit on this question earlier, but we'd like to hear from you. What is the goal of National Crime Victims' Rights Week?
The primary goal really is awareness. And that's, it can be about the history, it can be about where we're headed in the future. You know, National Crime Victim Rights Week was actually started under former President Reagan back in the early 80s. And it's progressed. Most states across the country, or all states across the country, have victims' rights. Only some of us actually have a constitutional amendment. But the annual process of talking nationally in every community about crime victims' rights is to generate awareness. And we can talk about, here's where we are now, here's where we've come from, here's where we ought to be. And that really is the emphasis, is that every year, 1 week in April, we hold multiple programs around the state, here in the state of Utah, in communities to talk about victimization, violent crime, victims' rights, and how our processes are geared to either help, unfortunately sometimes still hurt victims in those processes.
Wow. Okay, well, I'm sure you're full of information here. So what data or information do we know about violent crimes, and can you share some of those statistics?
I can. You know, in general, Utah does appreciate a lower crime rate than our neighboring states, and lower crime rates than the national averages tend to be, and that has been a long-standing historical trend. Unfortunately, where Utah really has work to do yet are in the areas of interpersonal crime, domestic violence, rape, and sexual assault. The only two areas of crime where Utah actually is higher than the national average of victimization types. And so we know we've got some work to do there.
Most definitely. What would you like to see happen in the future to help improve the quality of life for victims of these violent crimes?
You know, really, where we've got a long way to go in holding our system and those convicted accountable to the people that they've hurt, and the system being accountable to victims as well. If you look at a charging document from any court in the state, whether it's municipal or state court, it says state of Utah versus the accused, or West Valley City versus the accused. It's a first bad step in leaving out the important reality that there's been a human being so often that's been horribly impacted by someone's illegal criminal act. And you know, the system can issue a fine, it can incarcerate somebody, but where's the real justice for the victim? Where's the accountability of the system and of the offender to the victim to bring them back to whole, to help them heal as best as possible? You know, we can put victims' rights in place, we can put criminal offenders in jail, we can give them fines, but when is the system really going to start looking at a more restorative process of how do we help this victim heal, and how do we do that from a criminal justice system that says, yes, the state of Utah is bringing this action against the accused, but we're doing it in the interest of the person that they hurt.
The person. It's
the
a person.
person.
Yes. Thank you so much, Gary Scheller, the director of the Utah Office for Victims of Crime. Thank you for joining us here tonight. All that we've discussed will be on our website, abc4.com. We'll make sure the resources are there as well. Thanks again for your time, Gary.
Thank you.